and a PhD in American Jewish history from Brandeis University. He's taught at various places at Hebrew Union College, the University of Southern California, Hofstra University. It's Sunday morning. He's written numerous articles. One of the reasons we invited him as a scholar is because of his second book, which is called Jew-hooing the 60s, American Celebrity and Jewish Identity, which explores the nature of Jewish celebrity in the early 1960s and has chapters on Sandy Koufax, Lenny Bruce, Barbra Streisand, and Bob Dylan. He's now engaged in several book projects and currently is also developing a public history resource center called New York Jew Center for New York Jewish History. It is my great pleasure to invite him to talk to us on celebrity and identity in the American Jewish experience. My friends, Dr. David Kaufman.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thanks all for coming back today. It's a treat for me to be able to talk about my book, obviously a subject near and dear to my heart. This is the book cover. It's entitled Jew-hooing the 60s, American Celebrity and Jewish Identity, and I'll be getting into it in some depth, although I should say that it's really one of those books that's just chock full of material and information and stories, and that we certainly won't be able to cover the majority of it. So I'll do my best to summarize. Let me start with the word Jew-hooing in the title. Is that a word that people are familiar with? Probably not. It was coined by a colleague of mine writing about the phenomenon of pointing out the famous Jews in the culture. It was a takeoff on, you may recall, there was a website called Yahoo, and Jew-hoo was a website that spoofed the word Yahoo. And what the Jew-hoo website did was you could type in any name of any famous person and find out if they were Jewish or not, right? So that's the origin, the genesis of the term Jew. Jew-hooing, to Jew-hoo means to look out to the culture and say, oh, there's a Jew, that person's a Jew. So for example, have you ever said to anyone, did you know Tony Curtis's real name was Bernie Schwartz, right? Or did you know Natalie Portman, the actress, was born to Israeli parents and speaks a fluent Hebrew, right? I mean, that's what we mean by Jew-hooing. It's identifying people in the public eye, people in the public spotlight as Jews. Now, why do we do this? It's a habit for certainly every ethnic group, every minority group does this to some degree. We're all proud of our own members who have made it, right? So, if you're Italian, you're proud of Frank Sinatra and so forth and so on. But Jews, I want to suggest, do it just a little bit more, maybe a lot more. And there are reasons for that. One is simply there are an awful lot of Jews who have made it. We're a very small group. And one of the points of pride that we like to share is that so many of us have made it into the spotlight, whether as movie actors or comedians or journalists or politicians or what have you. Even though we're a very small group, look how much we have contributed. Look how many Nobel Prize winners there are who are Jewish. That's another one that's very common. I wonder if any of you have ever made that point or made that comment. It's, number one, a reflection of Jewish success and achievement, right? That there are so many Jews to point to. At the same time, not all, but many of those Jewish success stories have diminished or even suppressed their Jewishness. They may have changed their names. They may act as if they're not Jews. They may lead a life that isn't overtly, explicitly Jewish. And so by being in this public spotlight, not everyone is aware that they're Jewish. And so it's up to us, the rest of us Jews, to say, aha, to out them, to expose them for who they really are. And further reminding the world, look how well we Jews have done. Now, this relates in some degree In the book, I go into some greater detail about this and related to certain aspects of Jewish culture. Just briefly, you may know the Yiddish term yichus. Yichus means connection to someone big, someone prominent. You have yichus. If your uncle's neighbor's cousin is a big famous judge, that gives you yichus, right? So it's kind of baked into Jewish culture to some degree. There's also another Yiddish term, nachas. Nachas is probably one people know better. To shep nachas means to derive pleasure, tremendous joy and pleasure from the success and achievement of usually your children, right? You get nachas from them. So in a certain sense, we get nachas from Natalie Portman and Tony Curtis and all of the other Jews in the culture, right? So it's part of Jewish culture, but I do want to relate it to yesterday's talk and suggest that at some level, it is an assertion of the specialness of Jews. Again, traditionally, for centuries and centuries, we had the traditional belief that we were God's chosen people. It was taken for granted. We took it for granted that we were special in that regard. In the modern world, we modern Jews, no longer take that literally. But at some level, some subconscious level, we still see ourselves as standing apart, as being chosen in some not figurative sense. And by pointing out, by Jewhooing, we're making that claim. Look how special we are, that even though maybe God didn't choose us in the old-timey sense of being a literal divine selection, but certainly Jews, by virtue of their history, by virtue of our unique historical experience, we are different. We are special. Just look at Natalie Portman and Tony Curtis and so forth, right? So Jewhooing, I believe, is a kind of a secularized statement of chosenness, or a statement of secularized chosenness at some level. So that's kind of the one point of contact with yesterday. But how did I get interested in the subject is worth sharing. I was a grad student living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I used to haunt the many used bookstores in Cambridge. And I once came upon a little paperback that was a biography, a memoir of someone named Alan Sherman. How many people remember Alan Sherman? He was, right, I'm sure most of you do. His biggest hit was Hello Mutta, Hello Fada, right? But you may recall that he did a series of record albums of comedic songs on these record albums where he would take a Broadway tune or some old standard and give it new lyrics. And very often those lyrics were drenched with Jewish references. And I grew up on Alan Sherman songs, and as a Jewish kid in Brooklyn, New York, I loved, and I certainly wasn't the only one, I loved the Jewishness of it. And Alan Sherman became a real favorite. And what intrigued me about Alan Sherman was that he's writing his own memoir in 1965, already having become not a major celebrity, he's certainly a celebrity, a well-known pop culture figure. Apparently the Queen of England loved his records and used to play them all the time, right? So he had, he had his moment in the early 60s. So it brought my attention to that moment in American Jewish history. And I began to think about and wonder about what was it in the early 1960s that was in the air, that was riling up Jewish life and Jewish consciousness. Things were changing. And as I looked further into that period, I became absolutely intrigued by things such as, and almost always in pop culture, the introduction of Holocaust memory. For example, it's in 1961 that Adolf Eichmann is kidnapped by Israeli agents, brought back to Israel to stand trial, and they televise that trial internationally. And that's a major moment in bringing Holocaust consciousness to not only to Jews, but to the world. It's right around that moment also that the movie Exodus becomes a smash hit, 1960. In 1961, the movie Judgment at Nuremberg. So it's not only Holocaust consciousness, but it's also Israel becomes more and more part of our mindset and our value system. much more so than there were both the Holocaust and Israel were there in the 50s, but it's right around the turn of the 60s that it really explodes by virtue of popular culture. And I can go on and on about that, but having come to this issue through Alan Sherman, who you may recall his first record was entitled "My Son, the Folk Singer," right, which is a nice Jewish joke because it's a play on my son, the doctor, right? But in his case, it was "My Son, the Folk Singer." He made a second record, a follow-up to it. It was such a smash success. This follow-up was entitled "My Son, the Celebrity." So I'm becoming more and more interested in this issue of celebrity. And as I begin looking around, I again recognize that it's that moment, that early 1960s, 61, 62, 63, when suddenly a great number of Jews are bursting on the scene, as it were. Just one example, may she rest in peace, she just passed away, Barbara Walters. That was when she first is on air in 1961. And then a couple of years later, she'll become a major anchor woman for CBS News. Mike Wallace, also a Jew, also appears on TV right around that time. And there's a long list of such Jews in the public eye who first appear right around that moment, which is to say that for the rest of America, we Jews have suddenly become that much more visible and conspicuous. And then it raises the question whether they know that they're Jews. Did people watching Barbara Walters and Mike Wallace recognize them as New York Jews? Maybe, perhaps not. But it's during that moment that the question of how do I represent my Jewishness to the world at large comes about. And I began looking around for good examples of this. And I came upon what I determined were four of the most popular, famous, biggest celebrity figures of that time, or rather they become major celebrities, and it's in that moment that they appear. And then once I discovered the coincidence that it's September 27th, 1961. Where were you on that date? It was a week after the high holidays. It was so it was coming into the Sukkot season, September 27th, 1961. A young pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers named Sandy Koufax sets his first major league strikeout record, and he goes on over the next 5-6 years to become one of, if not the greatest pitcher in baseball history, a major celebrity, as we'll discuss. 2 days later, September 29th, 1961, in the New York Times, there's a small little item in one section of the paper describing a Jewish comedian who was already fairly well known. He'd already made a number of national television appearances, and he developed quite a bit of notoriety already. But it's that news item on September 29th that is the turning point, because it's the first time that Lenny Bruce will be arrested. And from that moment on, wherever he appears, there will be policemen in the audience and policemen beating down his hotel room. And every city he plays in, he will have an encounter with the law, and he will become notorious and even infamous in an entirely different way. And then sadly, he will die 5 years later in 1966. But it's that period where he reaches his greatest height of fame, or really, in a sense, infamy, because he becomes well known as a drug user, and more importantly, for his use of obscenity on stage, for subverting the taboo against saying certain things in public. Lenny Bruce becomes the key figure representing that extreme of free speech in America, and becomes a very famous Jew in the process. In that same newspaper, September 29th, 1961, in another section of the paper, there's a music review. By the Times music reviewer was named Robert Shelton. His real name was Shapiro. But Robert Shelton submits a review about a new young talent in town that he discovered down in Greenwich Village, playing in one of the coffee houses downtown in the folk revival scene of Greenwich Village of that day. And his name is Bob Dylan. And it's the first newspaper account or review of the man who will become the voice of his generation, who will become the most important cultural figure representing the counterculture of the 1960s is Bob Dylan. Same moment, same newspaper. A month later, now we have to go to October of 61, there will be another young Jewish performer who will begin attaining notice in New York, performing in nightclubs. And she will get her first role on an off-Broadway stage in that following month, in October. It was a little production called Another Evening with Harry Stoones, and it was a musical and comedy review. And one of the other young people in it was Dom DeLuise. But the young Barbara Streisand, at the age of 19, has her first stage role. A year after that, she will attain, or rather a month after that, she will audition for her first Broadway musical, I Can Get It For You Wholesale. And she will have the role of Miss Marmalstein, and that will catapult her further. And then it is a year after that that she will have her first starring role on Broadway, playing Fanny Brice in Funny Girl. That's in 1962. So all of this is happening. These four figures all burst on the scene, almost exactly the same moment. And as a historian, I have to wonder what's going on. What accounts for this explosion of Jewish talent and Jewish visibility at this particular moment? Now, for looking further at those four, what I also determined was that each of the four of them comes up with a very different answer to the question of how to represent being a Jew in the public spotlight, how to enact one's Jewishness, how to represent it. Again, this is the cover, and you see that I asked for them to be in profile. I didn't succeed with Dylan, but I did succeed in getting profiles of the others. And, you know, as you know, the Jewish nose, the shape of the nose is something that is a stereotype attributed to Jews. It's not, obviously, there are lots of Jews without a so-called Jewish nose, lots of people who have a so-called nose like that who are not Jewish. So it's a stereotype, let's admit that. Nevertheless, it is a signifier. It is one of the things that people looking at someone they don't know will assess them to be a Jew or not based on their appearance, based on their so-called Jewish looks. Again, Jewish looks is a stereotype. It's not a real thing. It's an image we have that's in the culture. But it's that kind of thing that I wanted to tease out in this book, is how do people see the Jewishness of someone very famous? So with that, that was all by way of introduction. Let me go to my my PowerPoint here, and we're going to, let's see. There we go. Okay, can everyone see this? So once again, the title, Jew-hooing the 60s, American Celebrity and Jewish Identity. I could speak for at much greater length about the nature of celebrity. What is celebrity about? How does celebrity function? And obviously, we could talk at great length about Jewish identity. And the one thing I'll say about Jewish identity is that it became more and more clear to me that there's something going on with Jewish identity in that early 60s period. It is not a coincidence that it is in the early 60s that the intermarriage, someone asked that question yesterday, the question of interfaith marriage, it's that moment in our history that the rate begins to shoot up. Prior to 1960, it was in the single digits, something like 6 or 7% of Jews would marry a non-Jew. Beginning in the 60s, it moves up to 12%, 18%, 27%, up until it's today well over 50%, as you noted. So there's something happening in that period. And one easy explanation or one thing that is clearly changing is that it's a new generation of Jews, mostly of the third generation, the grandchildren of the immigrants, who are beginning to do one thing in particular that almost every one of them has in common, that their parents only sometimes did, and that's going to college, right? Immigrants rarely, if ever, attended an American college. Their children, second generation, certainly will begin to go into the professions and get higher education, but it's the third generation that, growing up in suburbia quite often, that will go to college as a matter of course. and it's there where they are exposed to a larger, greater world, and that begins to influence who they are and how they act as Jews. And one of the behaviors that we look at and that we measure is who they choose to marry, marital choice. So the very nature of Jewish identity is in flux, and my study of these 4 celebrities is intended to get to that. So let's see. Our first celebrity, what I'll do is I'll just simply, it's a relatively short PowerPoint presentation, a series of slides of each of the 4 in succession. So we'll just talk a little bit about the 4. I imagine some of you are bigger Sandy Koufax fans, and some of you are bigger Barbara Streisand fans. You know, we have different strokes for different folks. So let me do each one of them in turn, and then we'll sum it up and talk about this subject all in a greater sense. Sandy Koufax. Sandy Koufax is a beloved figure. He was a young man from Brooklyn who was supremely athletically gifted, and he will be drafted by the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1955 as a very young man, I believe a 19-year-old. He was called a bonus baby, and he will sit on the bench for most of his first few seasons because he was very erratic. He could not throw the ball straight over the plate to get strikes. And even though he threw very hard, he was a wild thrower. And so he floundered for a bit. And then it was in the spring of 1961, again that year, that during spring training, his Jewish catcher, Norm Sherry, said to him, "Sandy, why don't you ease up a little bit? Don't try not to throw so hard. And you'll maybe that'll help." And that was the magic. That was the ticket. From that moment on, he begins to hit the strike zone, strike batters out, and have extraordinary command of his 2 major pitches, a fastball and a curveball, and the rest is history. And starting in 61 and through the next several years, he becomes, once again, one of the greatest ball players in history. And you see here on the left a wonderful biography of him. I'm sure some of you have read it, by Jane Levy, Sandy Koufax, A Lefty's Legacy. It's an extraordinary, she was given access to him and to many people. She was able to interview many people who knew him. So it's the best biography in terms of getting inside his head a little bit. But still, it is amazingly hagiographic in the sense of it being a love letter to him. There is not a critical word, not a negative word in this entire biography. It's just adulatory from beginning to end. And he was just quite a figure. He was a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn who had a very lovely personality and demeanor. He wasn't a braggart. He wasn't a big ego. You know, he was really a mensch, in addition to being a great baseball player, and that becomes part of his persona. You see on the right the Hall of Fame plaque that he's awarded at the age of 30. He is the youngest man ever to be granted entrance into the Baseball Hall of Fame, in part because he was so great, but also because he retired early. He had a very sore arm after all those years of abusing it, and was therefore immediately elevated to the Hall of Fame. That's Sandy Koufax, the pitcher. He has a pride of place in baseball history and American sports history. But of course, we're here for the Jewish angle. And so for that, let's go to some other images. First of all, before I get to the Jewish, these are some artistic renderings of Koufax, which I also looked at. Was one of the my source materials for all 4 of my figures, was looking at the way in which they were represented artistically, which gives you a sense that they, in some sense, transcend the ordinary level of celebrity and become, it's an overused word, but it fits. They become iconic figures. They become their images become meaningful in a way that transcends them as individuals. They become fixtures in our culture and in our consciousness. And that's certainly true of Sandy Koufax. And one of the ways you see that is through art. And so on the left is a wonderful painting of Sandy by the great British Jewish artist R.B. Kitaj, Kitaj. Kitaj, interestingly enough, was asked early in the 60s to do a painting of Koufax. And he had never heard of, not being a sports fan and not being an American, he'd never heard of Koufax. And he did this was for Sports Illustrated, he did an abstract of Koufax, which was completely unrecognizable. And as if to make up for it, once he learns later, he lives in LA for a while, he learns the importance of Koufax, he will submit this painting of Koufax later on. And then on the lower right, you see the most recent addition to this oeuvre, and that is the new statue of Sandy Koufax that's been erected outside of Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. And that's Sandy today standing next. This was just unveiled a few months ago, so this is very new, and that's Sandy Koufax today. And then the upper right two images are I guess are a nice segue to the Jewish, because they are a public mural in the city of Los Angeles. He began as a Brooklyn Dodger. You may recall the Brooklyn Dodgers moved out west to LA in 57, 58, and Sandy went with them. So he becomes a Los Angeles player. And it is on the side of a Jewish institution in LA called Cantor's Deli. Those of you who know LA, I'm sure know of Cantor's Deli on Fairfax Avenue, is one of the famous, iconic Jewish delicatessens of LA. And on the parking lot side, the entire building has a multi-paneled mural depicting the Jewish history of Los Angeles. And the panel on the upper right shows you the 60s. And so there's a picture of a bar mitzvah boy, as well as a student protest. And set into the student protest is this, and you'd see the detail in the middle, is this image of Koufax on the mound. Sandy Koufax was certainly the pride of Jewish LA to this day, as you might imagine. And here are a couple of images which go to the Jewish, specifically Jewish adulation of Koufax. You may have noticed I haven't mentioned the most important part of the Koufax Jewish myth, and that is the true story that during the World Series of 1965, he's at the height of his career, of his fame as an athlete. He is slated to pitch the first game of the World Series. The Dodgers are playing the Minnesota Twins, and he is going to start off the World Series, of course. However, as the newspapers begin to notice, and for weeks ahead of time begin to contemplate whether or not Sandy will take the mound, because that first game of the World Series falls on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. Will Sandy pitch? And of course, the day comes and he doesn't go up to the mound, but rather his fellow great pitcher, Don Drysdale, does instead. And famously, Drysdale had a poor outing and has to leave the game after a few innings. And Walter Alston, the manager, comes up to the mound to take Drysdale out, and Drysdale says to Alston, "Gee, bet you wish I was Jewish too, huh, Skip?" Right? So that's the famous joke in that moment. But the legend of Sandy Koufax, who is a good Jew, he doesn't pitch on Yom Kippur, comes out of that moment. Now, he had already been famous. He already was a hugely popular Jewish athlete, for reasons that you might imagine, right? There aren't that many great Jewish athletes. But it is in that moment that he becomes not only a major sports icon, not only a major American icon, but a major Jewish icon. He attains a level of Jewish celebrity that I don't know if has been matched. I'll give you, again, the book, there are many, many examples of this, but one of them is when Jon Stewart was on television on The Daily Show. He had a historian talking about the founding fathers. And he said he was making the point that they were Christian. And he said to Jon Stewart, "I bet you can name one Jewish founding father." And Jon Stewart scratches his head and says, well, Sandy Koufax. That's the one name he could come up with, right? Koufax has become the quintessential famous American Jew, Jewish American celebrity. Koufax now embodies that above and beyond his prowess as a baseball player. He has become a great Jew. In fact, there was I'll go to the next slide for that. There was you see him here on the left with the other great American Jewish baseball player with whom Koufax is sometimes compared, is Hank Greenberg, the great home run hitter of the 30s and 40s, the Jewish Babe Ruth. That's him on the far left here at a event with Sandy Koufax. Those are the two great Jewish ball players of all time. And so they're often grouped together, often discussed together. But it's this image on the right I want to talk about. This was in 2010, now 10 years ago, that Sandy Koufax was invited to the White House to not only meet the president, but to be part of Jewish American Heritage Day at the White House. And Sandy Koufax was sitting in the front of a room that included people you see all the way on the right, Theodore Bickel, and there were Jewish senators and Jewish astronauts and Jewish other Jewish sports figures, a room full of Jewish celebrities and Jewish luminaries of all kind. But Sandy Koufax has pride of place. Sandy Koufax sits in the front row, right next to Michelle Obama. And when President Obama gets up to give his little spiel, he says, wow, what an audience, what a crowd. We have Jewish senators and Jewish astronauts and Jewish this and Jewish that. And Sandy Koufax, in other words, Sandy Koufax is in a league of his own. And then Obama added a cute little line. He said, Sandy and I are both lefties. We have that in common, but he can't pitch on Yom Kippur. I can't pitch, was the joke that President Obama made. In other words, that's how iconic and well-known is that Yom Kippur story about Sandy Koufax. Now, again, I could go on at great length. There's a very lengthy and detailed chapter about Koufax in the book. But I will sum it up by saying that Koufax has come to represent the great American Jew because he both is extraordinarily successful in an American sport, the American sport. Baseball for a very long time was considered the national pastime. It represents, it symbolizes America on a very deep level. And therefore, a Jew in that sport has really, truly made it on the American scene. And at the same time, Koufax is the quintessential nice Jewish boy who doesn't pitch on the holy day, who is going to obey and pay respect to and homage to the Jewish tradition. He's both a good American and a good Jew at the same time. And that combination, that synthesis, is one that we sometimes struggle to preserve a balance between. And therefore look to figures like Sandy Koufax, who he made in reality, in real life, he may not be such a good Jew. He certainly didn't sit out that game because of his own religiosity. He did it because he knew it was the right thing to do. But he comes to symbolize for us good Americanness and good Jewishness combined. So Koufax's celebrity is amplified beyond his sports achievement for those reasons amongst American Jews. And now we'll go to the next figure. The next figure is not so much a nice Jewish boy, more of a bad Jewish boy, more of a bad boy. And that is the man born as Leonard Alfred Schneider, better known as Lenny Bruce. You see on the left here, he runs away and joins the Navy at the age of 16. You see L.A. Schneider. His original name was Leonard Alfred Schneider. And on the right, a picture of the young Lenny, just as he's entering show business at the age of 20 or 21. He's following in his mother's footsteps. His mother was in show business. She was a dancer, singer, comedian, burlesque performer. And he goes into the family business in a sense, following in her footsteps. And he wants to become a comedian. And he will struggle for most of the 1950s as kind of a hack, a schlock comedian. His greatest claim to fame is he used to introduce, he was the MC in strip clubs, and he would introduce the strippers. And his greatest claim to fame during that time is he once came on stage completely naked. In other words, mimicking the strippers, right? Playing the role of a stripper. And he developed a certain notoriety amongst his fellow hack comedians during that time, but it's only in the late 50s that he begins to develop a following. And by 1960, he becomes a national figure, one of the leading comedians in a new trend that was sometimes kind of poorly named. They were called the sick comedians. And they included people like Elaine May and Bob Newhart and very cerebral comedians. Mort Saul was part of that group. They were really separated by their intelligence, their intellectuality, much more so than their dirtiness or their sickness. But I guess the culture may have felt a little bit threatened by them and deemed them the sick comedians. Lenny Bruce, of course, is the most famous, and he's the one who pushes the boundaries the furthest. I give you this photo on the left, a typical photo of what he looked like on stage, performing at his height. And then, of course, this very well-known part of a routine of his. The routine is known as Jewish and Goyish. It's something that comedians do quite frequently to this day. They'll talk about the difference between men and women, or the differences between blacks and whites. Lenny was one of the first to do this, but he did it along the lines of the differences between Jews and non-Jews. The word Goyish is, as you know, the Yiddish term for non-Jewish, and he would introduce not only that word, but other Yiddishisms into his stage act. And so just on the level of his language, he introduced Jewishness into his comedy, but then he took it a step further and talked about it. He would, for example, unlike all of the other comedians of the day who would also change their names and hide behind the mask that the name change provided, Lenny Bruce would stand on stage and say, you know what? My real name is Leonard Alfred Schneider. I know up on the marquee it says Lenny Bruce, but I'm really a Schneider. And that would be the premise of a comedy routine, would be his hidden Jewishness. He would expose himself. Right, he exposed himself in the strip clubs, and here he's exposing himself in a different way. He exposes his own Jewishness, and he begins to talk about it. He begins to make it the subject of his comedy routines. Again, in the early 1960s, no one else was doing this. Lenny Bruce was an absolute pioneer in introducing, first of all, stream of consciousness, that kind of extreme honesty on stage, just opening your mind and exposing your inner thoughts. That was largely Lenny Bruce. And part of that is the question of Jewishness. And part of what the early 60s represents is a kind of a pivot between a period when we were shy about that and we were nervous about being too Jewish, and then the more expressive, self-confident, prideful Jewishness that would emerge in the later 60s. The early 60s and some people like Sandy Koufax and Lenny Bruce provide that pivot. And here is, if you probably already read it as I've been talking, dig, I'm Jewish. Count Basie is Jewish, right? So this is part of, again, his Jewish Goyish routine. Not what you'd expect. Ray Charles, another black singer, black musician rather, is Jewish. Eddie Cantor, Goyish. What? What's going on here? B'nai Brit is Goyish. What? Hadassah, Jewish. If you live in New York City, or New York, or any other big city, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter even if you're Catholic. If you live in New York, you're Jewish. If you live in Butte, Montana, you're going to be Goyish, even if you're Jewish, right? So he's playing with these designations, with these characterizations. The dividing line between Jewish and Goyish isn't so black and white. It's not so clear cut. He's subverting it. He's challenging it. He's playing with us and playing with this assumption, right? The Jewish generation before Lenny Bruce had a very strict, in their minds, very strict dividing line between Jewish and Goyish, right? You don't cross that line very easily. Lenny Bruce is hopscotching back and forth over that line and turns it into comedy, and it informs it helps make him the subversive and countercultural figure that he becomes. One of the things about Lenny Bruce that's less often appreciated is just how much of it is, even though he dies tragically in 1966, he's a major influence on the hippies and the yippies and the counterculture of the later 1960s. Someone like Abby Hoffman said Lenny was my God. Right. So he really is very much, even though he will meet a tragic end, his influence lives on. And here you see a little bit of the more controversial Lenny Bruce. On the left is a mugshot of Lenny having been arrested. Actually, this is earlier. He before he was famous, he had a kunz. A kunz is Yiddish for he played a trick on people. He used to pretend to be a Catholic priest and go around in the wealthy Catholic neighborhoods of suburban Miami, knocking on doors and saying he's Brother Matthias and he's collecting money for his foundation to help the lepers. And he would be invited in for tea, and he would often take their confession. And he played the role of a priest, which he would then later talk about on stage. And it was one of his major deceptions and kunzes that he would play. And here on the right is one of his record albums after he begins to become a controversial figure, often arrested. And you see a very evocative illustration of him with the hand that's muffling him is the American flag. And it's America that's trying to silence him. He's the champion of free speech. We should be able to say anything, right? Later on, George Carlin would take up that mantle, but in Lenny Bruce's day, he would be arrested again and again, and ultimately hounded into not being able to perform in very many places. And there are those who say that's what led to his untimely death, so that he was in a sense martyred by his own crusade for free speech. And this is the last set of images of Lenny Bruce, just to give you a sense of him as a human being. He met and married an Irish Catholic stripper named Hot Honey Harlow. That's them early on in the lower left, and that's a later picture of him married to Honey and with their one child, Kitty Bruce, who's now an adult. I have to say was extremely helpful to me in assembling the materials and republishing many of the routines of Lenny Bruce. He had an extraordinary number of stand-up routines that talked about being Jewish and talked about anti-Semitism and talked about other Jewish issues. And so I was able to republish many of that thanks to Kitty. And so I have to give it up for her and say a public thank you to her. But you also see on the lower right his tombstone in Hollywood. And here his original name Schneider is given back to him, and there's a Jewish star. In a sense, his Jewishness is re-emphasized at that moment, that end of life moment in which we lost Lenny, and he dies at the very early age of 40 of a drug overdose, and leaves behind a wife and child. Although he had divorced Honey, and it was a very contentious relationship, but still, this was his family. Okay, next image, next personage, another like Lenny, another somewhat subversive countercultural figure, although now with Jewishness much more of a fraught relationship, and that is the young man who will grow up in Hibbing, Minnesota, a small town on the Iron Range in northern Minnesota. Hibbing, not very many Jewish families in town. One of them was the Zimmerman family, and their son was Robert Zimmerman, who later will become much better known as Bob Dylan. He will change his name coming out of college and out of high school. As he spends 1 year at college, it's that year that he changes his name. But here you see a very nice picture of him as a small child, a couple of pictures of him in school. These are 1957 and 58, those two school photos, and a photo of him in one of his early musical groups, him with the guitar standing in the middle. That's him as a budding rock and roller as a teenager. So he was aspiring to be a musical star from early on. During that 1 year at the University of Wisconsin, he discovers Woody Guthrie, the great folk musician, and becomes a kind of an acolyte, and first of all takes on folk music as his major form of music in that early period, and then travels to New York to find Woody Guthrie and visit him and make a pilgrimage to the great man. And it is during that era, that early period, again, the early 60s, where Robert Zimmerman becomes Bob Dylan. In a very short order, he attains tremendous notice. I mentioned his early the review of him by Robert Shelton earlier. That's a moment when he's unknown in late '61. Within a year, he becomes widely known. He begins writing music, writing songs like Blowin' in the Wind, The Times They Are Changing. These songs become recorded by many other musical stars of the time. And Bob Dylan himself becomes, with each passing year, more and more famous. By 1964, 65, he's on the level of the Beatles. And you're seeing these pictures are all of him in that early era when he's becoming Bob Dylan. One of his major role models is this gentleman on the lower right. That's Bob Dylan in Greenwich Village with Ramblin' Jack Elliott. Jack Elliott was the premier Woody Guthrie imitator. And so Dylan, who does get to meet Woody Guthrie, although by that time he's very ill and he's in a hospital, he does become best friends with Ramblin' Jack here in Greenwich Village. Ramblin' Jack, as you see, has wearing the cowboy hat, speaks with a drawl. He's the main representative of what Woody Guthrie represents. And when sitting in a cafe in Greenwich Village with a bunch of other folkies, when the young Dylan discovers that Ramblin' Jack Elliott, his real name is Elliott Asnapuz. He was the son of a Jewish dentist in Brooklyn. Apparently, Dylan rolls over in laughter, rolls on the floor in laughter, because here was someone who did an even better job than he had of disguising his origins. Right? Dylan would tell tall tales about having been an orphan from Nebraska, from the Wyoming and the like. Did not share the fact that his parents too were a nice Jewish couple. His father was a furniture salesman, and he himself was originally named Zimmerman. At first, this was hidden. In order to put on the persona of a folkie, he disguised his true origins. But once it becomes known that Dylan is Zimmerman, the process of Jewhooing clicks in very early on. And many of his fans, many of whom were Jewish to begin with, begin keying into the fact that their hero was, like them, Jewish, in fact. And although the young Bob Dylan wasn't overtly, explicitly Jewish in any way, the knowledge of his Jewishness becomes part of the knowledge of his fans, and therefore part of his celebrity. And we'll see that as we move on. Here's a possible example. This is as the countercultural 60s move on. He grows his hair out, he grows a beard. He's probably the major influence in the popularity of the hairstyle known as a Jew fro. What you're looking at is probably the original Jew fro. I once asked a Black studies scholar of Black hairstyles if she thought that Dylan's Jew fro may have played any role in influencing the Afro. And I got this colleague of mine was not amused. She didn't think that was very funny, the idea that a Jew would have influenced the Afro style. I actually think it's in the same moment, so I don't think it's completely unrelated. In any event, it is Dylan who, like the Beatles, popularizes long hair. In his case, it's this kind of frizzy hairstyle, which is identified with Jews. Once again, you see the profile. And speaking of the profile, there is the poster you see on the left was an insert in a 1966 record album. It was done by the great graphic artist Milton Glaser. Milton Glaser also is famous for the I Love New York logo. He just passed away last year. He was the great graphic artist of his generation. He's famous for a lot of things, but this is probably one of his more famous images. This silhouetted image of Dylan with the psychedelic hair, Jufro, right? That goes to the psychedelia of the 60s. But then the face is darkened, is blackened, is obscured. In other words, there's something obscure about Dylan's identity. The face is the identity. And I was able to interview Glaser by phone. And I asked him, I said, by showing Dylan this way in profile, which emphasizes that nose in particular, I asked Mr. Glaser, were you attempting to show his Jewishness in that moment? And and with this famous image. And Milton Glaser, to his great credit, he was very gracious in his reply. He said to me, well, not consciously, but you never know what's in the subconscious. In other words, he may have inscribed Jewishness on this image of his hero, his culture hero at the time, without fully realizing it, which I thought was very kind of him to he didn't say no outright, right? But then, of course, there will be much more explicit Judaizing of Dylan's image. I'll start on the right. This is a bootleg record of an infamous a phone interview that A.J. Weberman. A.J. Weberman was probably one of Dylan's most obsessive, crazy fans. He called himself a Dylanologist. So he was the one who coined that term. And to this day, there is a group of people who are so obsessed with everything about Dylan that the term Dylanologist really fits. I like to say that, I started off as, I was a fan of Dylan when I started, and then I learned so much, I became a much bigger fan and a more, a scholar of Dylan, but I'm still not a Dylanologist. There's a whole another level of Dylan mania that is part of what I documented in my chapter. A.J. Weberman was one of the first. He interviewed Dylan by phone, and that interview was then put out as a bootleg record. But notice that it doesn't say Bob Dylan versus A.J. Weberman. It says Robert Zimmerman. The name Zimmerman will become part of the Jewhooing of Bob Dylan. When Zimmerman is used, it's a way of saying, we know who you really are. We're telling the world who you are behind the mask. And in fact, Dylan himself at a famous Halloween concert in Carnegie Hall, Dylan himself from the stage, this is in 1963, he said to the audience, I have my Bob Dylan mask on. Notice he himself acknowledged that the celebrity image of Dylan was a kind of a pretense, a kind of a mask. On the left was a comic book that came out in the 70s, put out by the people at National Lampoon magazine. It's a little maybe mildly anti-Semitic. It was done by a number of non-Jewish artists. But what's important for me is that it demonstrated, it sort of put Dylan, it cast Dylan as a militaristic Israeli, right? Sort of linking Dylan to Israel and with a kind of implicit critique of Israeli politics, which it was unfair at the time, certainly. And it was a little over the top. It was a little bit in bad taste, but it is just one example of many, many, many others I could show of the way in which Dylan, notice he's in the middle. Not only does he have a Star of David on his pilot helmet, but he has a kippah on top of his head, right? He's a very Jewish looking Dylan. It's not Dylan, it's Zimmerman. And in fact, it's a takeoff on the Superman comic books where Zimmerman is Superman, or I guess Zimmerman is the secret identity, like Clark Kent, of Bob Dylan being the public persona, right? So they're playing on the Superman Clark Kent duality. Okay, anyway, Dylan has come to be, much like Sandy Koufax, a Jewish symbol. The last thing I'll share with you is a number of years ago, I was traveling in Poland, and the town next to the death camp of Auschwitz, from which Auschwitz gets its name, is in Polish Oswiecim. Oswiecim is the town which had a Jewish population prior to the war, and the old synagogue of Oswiecim is now a Jewish museum. It's the Auschwitz Jewish Museum. It sounds very odd, obviously. But in that museum, I'm walking around, and I see a display by local school children who were asked to make portrayals of famous Jews. And so there were, some Israeli political figures and some American comedians and and in the middle of it was an image, there was Franz Kafka, European cultural figures. In the middle of it was a picture of Bob Dylan. It was in that, so I'm standing a few miles away from Auschwitz. I'm looking at a series of Jewish celebrity portraits done by Polish school children. And who was in the middle of it but Bob Dylan, which signified to me that as famous as he is for being Bob Dylan, he has attained at the same time a level of Jewish celebrity that puts him into a certain category as well. Okay, and finally, our last figure, our final of the four, is probably the one who is the most widely associated with Jewishness, and that is Barbra Streisand. And the reason that Barbra Streisand is the most Jewishy of my four is that she herself embraces her Jewishness from early on. One minor but significant mark of this or indication is that she will not change her name, right? Early on in her career, she's trying to make it on the Broadway stage and then on film, on stage and screen. She will be advised that perhaps a less Jewishy sounding name might be helpful. And she holds her ground and says, no, Barbra Streisand is her name. She does change the spelling of her first name. So she gets rid of an A in the middle. So it's not Barbara as you see her here, but she gets rid of that second A and it's Barbara. So that's the one, the one change she will make. And of course, probably more famously, she's also advised to get a nose job, right? With that nose, honey, you'll never make it in Hollywood. And once again, and there are different versions to the story of who advised her and what she said and why she chose not to. There is some debate over it, but the basic point is that she did not. She kept her original Jewish looks, and as she becomes famous, extraordinarily famous, based upon the extraordinary beauty of her singing voice and the brassiness of her acting, and she becomes a major Hollywood star for a good reason. Her looks, which originally were said to be a detriment, become a kind of a plus, become an advantage for her. She becomes known by them as much as for her talent. Now, here we have some wonderful photographs. On the far left is her as a little girl, which shows you what she was adorable. She was certainly a little sweetheart, but also a little bit of a miskite. You could see that she wasn't necessarily going to be the most beautiful girl growing up. A miskite is not a nice word. I apologize. It's Yiddish for an ugly girl. A little. I apologize. I don't mean to embrace the sexism, but it certainly was part of Yiddish culture, those kinds of words. The view in the center I love. It's her high school graduation photograph from Erasmus High School. My dad went to Erasmus, so I have that sense of connection. She graduated a year early, at the age of 18. At the age of 17, she graduates from high school and demands that her mother allow her to move into Manhattan to pursue an acting career at that early age. So she's an 18-year-old as she's making the rounds in Manhattan, being rejected in one theatrical office after another. Why do they reject her? Because they take one look at her and she looks like this photo on the right. She looked a little bit crazy. The word used at the time was kooky. Again and again, she's described as a kook, as an eccentric, as a Brooklyn Jewish girl who would say or do anything. And one of the ways she achieves her celebrity, she makes a name for herself. She will begin singing in nightclubs around New York City. I mentioned that. But at the same time, she will begin appearing on television talk shows. Mike Wallace, in particular, has a talk show on which she appears multiple times. And the reason they keep inviting her back is because of what a kook she is. It's the personality. It's her persona as a kooky Brooklyn Jewish girl who would say anything. Now, remember, this is in the early 60s. We've yet to come to the later countercultural 60s where things, go crazy. Barbra Streisand, it's been noted by me and others, is like Bob Dylan, and like Lenny Bruce, is a kind of an early influence, a precursor of that counterculture. She's one of the people that is going to break free of the strictures of 1950s American culture, where everyone had to behave and have a sense of propriety. It was a kind of a very much more of a more regulated environment. The 60s is the opposite. The 60s is about freedom. The 60s, one might argue, the 60s goes too far. But a primary influence on that liberation of the 60s will be a number of Jewish figures as the ones we're talking about. And Barbra Streisand deserves to be on that list as well. This is a great photograph of her with her first husband, Elliot Gould, who she meets. He's co-star of that first play she's in on Broadway, and they have a very famous love affair. And it's just a wonderful photograph of the two of them when they were both so young, both in their early 20s, both now emerging stars, first in the New York theater and later on the Hollywood screen. And this is the moment where she becomes very, very, very famous as Funny Girl. Playing Fanny Brice on Broadway is what catapults her to superstardom. It is around this moment that she will be invited to the White House. Again, she's 21 years old. She's a major Broadway star. John F. Kennedy, several months before his tragic assassination, invites her to the White House. That's how famous she has become already. And Kennedy apparently said to her, "Oh, young lady, nice to meet you. How long have you been singing?" And she, in her Brooklyn accent, says, "About as long as you've been president." Right? So that there was that famous exchange between her and JFK. It's right around that moment. But Streisand isn't done. She is going to remake herself and turn herself into a glamorous Hollywood starlet. And she does it partly through makeup, right? The eyeshadow was a big part of that, the hairdos, the dress, she becomes groomed in a way for Hollywood stardom over the course of the next. And I just want to remind you again that it is in this moment that she is proving them all wrong. All of those naysayers who had suggested that she could never make it because of her looks, she is going to leave them all behind in the dust. And it's these kinds of glamour photos which give you a sense of that. It is in the 70s that she becomes a major Hollywood motion picture star, most particularly 1974's The Way We Were. And I want to suggest that as Jewish as her role as Fanny Brice was, and as Jewish certainly as her role in the early 80s will be as Yentl, those are very Jewish roles, and one could suggest that Streisand is so Jewishly associated that any role she plays is going to be perceived as Jewish. I'd like to suggest that it is her role as Katie Moravsky in The Way We Were is her most quintessentially Jewish role, in that she plays a Jewish woman, first in 1930s, Depression-era America, as a college student, and later on through the war period, and then into the post-war period, a vitally important period in American Jewish history that she embodies in that role. And it's not a perfect film, but it is a perfect evocation of an American Jewish woman living through the middle of the 20th century. An iconic role for an iconic star. And then on the right is her Playboy cover in 1977, kind of the height of her celebrity, the height of her fame, making the cover of any national magazine is a big deal. But the fact that it was Playboy, a magazine that played upon sexual objectification, the fact that Streisand is the cover girl is really quite extraordinary. And you see what the line is. It has her saying, "What's a nice Jewish girl like me doing on the cover of Playboy?" So much as Koufax transcended his nice Jewish boy reputation by being a great sports star, here we also see a kind of transcending of what might be a limitation. By being called a nice Jewish girl, she's exploded that. She's proven once and for all that a nice Jewish girl can make it big. Not only make it big, but make it to the greatest star of all time. Streisand really is a very powerful image in that regard. And here, of course, is her in art. There is a wonderful artist named Deborah Kass, Kass. She's just been recently, a piece of hers has been installed in the Jewish Museum recently. It's just two letters. It's the letter Y-O. But then if you go around to the back of it, it spells Oi. So the Oi-Yo sculpture of Deborah Kass is, again, a perfect example of that duality of American on one side, Jewish on the other. And Deborah Kass also had made a name for herself in her various portrayals of Barbra Streisand, a la Andy Warhol, where Warhol was the one who pioneered this style of taking famous figures and further iconicizing them through his artwork. Right? He did it with Elvis. He did it with Marilyn Monroe, and he did it with all sorts of famous figures. Deborah Cass will give that treatment to Streisand. And in fact, the two images on the right, which show her in her role of Yentl, is entitled by the artist, Deborah Cass, My Elvis. In other words, growing up, it was Barbra Streisand who was her great star role model. She was the biggest fan of Streisand. And her role in Yentl is important, not only in that it's a very explicitly Jewish film about Jewish life back in the old country in Eastern Europe, but two things. One, Streisand not only stars in it, but she directed and produced it. She's the director as well as the star. That's number one. And number two, what's the subject matter? It's a young Jewish woman pretending to be a Jewish boy in order to gain entree to Jewish learning, Jewish scholarship, who then falls in love with her fellow yeshiva bacher played by Mandy Patinkin, right? So there are all these twists and turns playing on that line of gender and sexuality, which in a certain sense is a metaphor for that line between Jewish and Goyish. And we see that's a theme that will come up again and again. I mentioned it with Lenny Bruce, and it certainly is the case with Barbra Streisand and throughout Hollywood. Just last night, I was watching Some Like It Hot on television. The fact that it's this classic comedy written by Jews, starring two Jews, Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe, right? And is about cross-dressing, that blurring of that line, of that divide between the sexes. I'm sure many of you feel, and I quite agree, that our culture today may have gone a little too far with that fluidity, but certainly there is a connection to be drawn between that gender bending theme of Hollywood film and other art forms and the tension between being Jewish and being Goyish, between being Jewish and being part of the American whole, between being particularistic, who you are, who your identity is, and the universal, being part of the greater whole. That's a tension we all live in. It's a tension that characterizes the American Jewish experience across the board. And I want to suggest to you in closing that one of the many ways in which we attempt to resolve that tension, to square that circle, is by looking to famous Jews and looking to their example and to what they represent for how it is in fact possible to both be a great famous American like Steven Spielberg, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, even Albert Einstein, certainly Barbra Streisand, while at the same time being a great Jew. It is a lesson we not only teach to our children, as in this children's book, but it is a lesson we take to heart ourselves every time we Jew-hoo, every time we point to someone famous who's Jewish like us. It means something. It's being done for some deeper reason or greater purpose. And with that, I will thank you all. I hope I didn't go on too long today. More than happy, as always, to take questions. And let's see, I'm having trouble getting out of this now. Here we go. Okay.
I can't find
There we go. There we go. I stopped you sharing.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Okay.
We have a question already in the chat.
Wonderful.
And my folks, just a reminder to you, if you want to ask questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can put up your hand by going to reactions and pressing on the thing that says raise hand. Jim Strauss asks, what about Jewish scientists and Nobel Prize winners? Why didn't you choose those to document as Jewish?
If I had, it would have been that's a nice question. I mean, and again, as I indicated earlier, that is hello. You might want to mute yourself so that we don't.
Yeah, I'm looking, trying to see who's unmuted.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're fine now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, certainly that as I indicated earlier, that's a big one. That's a popular one. Is Nobel Prize winners, in other words, great scientists, great thinkers, great writers, all of which are valorized by the Nobel Prize. I certainly could have done it. It's an interest of mine. I happen to live around the corner from a monument. I live around the corner from the Museum of Natural History, and behind the Museum of Natural History is Teddy Roosevelt Park. And Teddy Roosevelt, amongst other things, was the very first American recipient of a Nobel Prize. It was the Peace Prize. And so there's a monument listing every American winner of a Nobel Prize from beginning to end, starting with Teddy Roosevelt. And then, of course, what I do is when I'm walking my dog and when I'm passing by is I Jew it, right? I pick out all of the Jews, and there are obviously quite a few, and so that's a subject of interest to me. It's why I didn't do it in the case of this book. It would have needed to be a particularly famous, a very, very famous figure at that particular moment in time. So the one that comes to mind is maybe Albert Salk might have been sort of the great Jewish scientist of that era, but Salk is even a little bit earlier. Salk is really, I mean, he comes up with the vaccine for polio earlier in the 50s. So by the 60s, he's no longer as conspicuous as these four were. I think maybe I was also, I started this book while living in Los Angeles, so I might have been also more disposed toward pop culture as opposed to that higher culture that represented by the Nobel Prize. But certainly another listing like this that I'm working on now is an A to Z listing of iconic New York Jews, right? I mean, as you heard earlier, I'm working on the history of the New York Jewish community. And for every letter of the alphabet, I'm choosing a particular figure. So for the letter Y, I've got a woman who's on that monument of Nobel Prize winners. I don't know if you've heard of her. Rosalind Yallow was a very prominent chemist who wins the Nobel Prize. And so I'm in writing about Rosalind Yallow, I'm going to be writing about other scientists like Salk, et cetera, in that, which is an important category, certainly. But in this case, I think I was proceeding on the assumption that it's popular culture that affects us most profoundly and is going to enable a shift of our consciousness and of our identity. We respond to pop culture in a pretty powerful way. So that was the governing assumption here. So I don't know if a Jonas Salk has quite the same impact as a Sandy Koufax.
So Diane has a question, and she needs to unmute herself.
Okay, thank you, by the way, for two wonderful presentations. We appreciate it. I was thinking of authors during the 1960s, people like Bellow and, of course, Roth. And Roth, to me, is so interesting because he becomes the bad Jew, right? I think Portney's complaint is 69. I may be wrong. And then I'm also interested in Roth because I've read essays of his later in life, which he says, no, I'm not an American Jewish author. I'm an American author. And I owe as much to the American canon as I do to any Jewish canon.
Of course, if you're familiar with his writing, Diane, as you are, you know how Jewish it is.
Absolutely. But with Portney, I mean, he had so much criticism piled on him. So it's a different kind of Jew-hooing, I guess. Well,
but that would be similar to Lenny Bruce. I mean, in a certain sense, you were right to say here's another bad Jew. And so, in a way, I could say, well, I already had Lenny Bruce, right?
Right.
If I could write a sequel of this, Philip Roth would certainly be high in that list. The others, Bernard Malamud, Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, those are all in the 50s. Those all precede my era. Philip Roth is the perfect timing. His debut novella and short story collection, Goodbye Columbus, is 1959. So the timing there, so you're right that it's then 10 years later that Portnoy's complaint comes out. So that's a little bit late for me, but otherwise Philip Roth would have been perfect, absolutely. And who knows, maybe I will write a sequel. And then I have to share with you just a personal reminiscence. Philip Roth used to live around the corner, used to live in my neighborhood. And that monument I mentioned of the Nobel Prize winners, you may know that Philip Roth never won a Nobel Prize and always hoped to. He was always on the short list. I saw him on more than one occasion sitting on a bench in Teddy Roosevelt Park, staring at that monument.
And he was angry, right, when Dylan got it.
I don't think he was alive any longer. Was he still?
No, I think he was.
Okay.
I recall.
Well, thanks for that.
So,
I'll
because
look that
I
up.
recall a snide remark of his.
Yeah, could certainly be. Yeah, but he certainly believed he deserved it and hoped he would win it. And I used to see him, and I had one short encounter with him where some woman was hounding him. He had just recently announced that he was retiring from writing, and there was a lady. I was walking my dog, and a woman came up to him and said, "What do you mean you're not writing anymore? How dare you?" And he said, "Lady, I'm 100 years old. What do you want from me?" And I started laughing. And I forget what it said, but he said to me, "Well said, young man." I said something in his defense, in other words.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you for that. Yeah.
Darla Strauss has a question for you.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the selection of the four people and how I remember all of them except for maybe Sandy Koufax. I wasn't into baseball so much, but I'm thinking back to times before and the Charlie Chaplin, the Al Jolson, the Marx Brothers, only because my dad was so crazy about all of them. So, I mean, if you were to look at I don't know that you even have a commentary about that, but I'm
it's in the introduction.
Your next book.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's Darla? Yes, thank you, Darla. I have a very lengthy introduction in the book, and I note that there has not yet been written a history of American Jewish celebrity. That would be a terrific book, right? I mean, there are lots of things that touch on that, but not a to Z kind of history. And so I do a little bit of that in the introduction, and I talk about that history would begin in one of two places. It would either begin in the immigrant ghetto, where people like Yossele Rosenblatt, the great cantor, was a kind of a culture hero. He was a kind of a celebrity, right? He had that level of celebrity within that world. That then said Molly Pecan was a major celebrity in that world, right? And then she achieves a wider celebrity as well. And there are other figures like that. Or if you're looking at American celebrity, then two of the greatest, biggest, monumental figures, you mentioned one of them, arise in the earliest part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s. One of them was Charlie Chaplin, who is not Jewish, by the way, but achieves a level of fame that was unprecedented. His famousness, his celebrity is international and astronomical, right? So the history of celebrity would have to look at Chaplin. And right around Chaplin actually has a little bit of competition for that level of celebrity. Someone who also achieves major monumental fame is Houdini. And Houdini, as you may know, was the son of a rabbi. Houdini was very much a Jew. So those two figures, a history of American celebrity might begin with them. And then you would then get to the teens and 20s when some of the greatest pop culture figures are Al Jolson, Fanny Brice, Sophie Tucker, Eddie Cantor, Georgie Jessel, right? There is a kind of the immigrant Jewish era produces a number of major celebrities. And someone like Jolson, he calls himself the world's greatest. I'm the greatest entertainer. And, it was to some degree hyperbole and ego on his part, but it was to some degree true. He really had achieved a new level. And then that only increases over time. So then you have and again, forgetting about Jews for a moment, you have the level of fame of a Sinatra and a Betty Grable during the war years. And then Elvis Presley is another level, and then the Beatles are another level. So celebrity in general is something that is accelerating over the course of the 20th century. Part of that is due to the growth of mass media, right? The Hollywood movie stars are also very important in this early development of fame and celebrity in America. And there is a Jewish role in that from early on. And so there's a kind of interweaving or dovetailing between the history of celebrity and the history of famous Jews in America. as I noted earlier, for the most part, with certain exceptions, most of those pre-60s Jewish celebrities are doing so by masking their Jewishness, right? Bernie Schwartz becomes Tony Curtis. Izzy Danielevich becomes Kirk Douglas. Again and again, the names are changed. The Hollywood studios, in making Danny Kaye into a big star, had him dye his hair color. It was too dark. It was too ethnic looking, right? So the Hollywood, the star making process of Hollywood was tamping down. Didn't want anyone to be too Jewish. Right now, there are exceptions to that. Someone like Molly Goldberg, the role played by Gertrude Berg, that was a huge star of radio and then television in the 40s and 50s, a very explicitly Jewish figure and very famous. So there are always exceptions to the rules, but part of this history of Jewish celebrity is also the history of assimilation giving way to identity. And that's what my study was.
David, I just wanted to say, you made me think when you mentioned Houdini of a question Rabbi Joseph asked a couple of years ago at a session. She said, if you were to invite somebody to dinner for maybe Passover dinner, who might it be? And most people were saying, I would like to get my mother to come back. I'm my great uncle. And I said, I would like to invite Houdini.
Oh, nice.
And I remember she said, she just stopped for a moment and she said, why would you want Houdini to come? And I had so many thoughts in my mind, I couldn't answer the question. I just remember that like it was yesterday.
He was a fascinating figure, no question.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. One of his things was he used to, especially late in his career, he used to go to great lengths to debunk people who led I forget what the term is, people who would like call on the spirits and do seances, and he would show that they were all con artists, they were all fakes, and yet because he was a real mama's boy, he was so attached to his mother. After she passed, he still he used to do seances to try to contact his dearly departed mother.
Right.
So so our retired journalist, Bill Solganic, looked up Roth died in 2018 and Dylan won a Nobel Prize in 2016. So that story is possible. So there's our fact check.
That's good.
And then we have a great question from Hal Kassoff in the chat. And just reminding you can put your hands up or put the questions in the chat. Hal asks, in your alphabetical listing of New York Jews, what do you have for Q and X?
Oh, that's such a good question. I did have that problem. And in both cases, it was a colleague of mine who helped me out and gave me the solution to the problem, both with Q and X, it so happens. There are a number of other letters that were difficult as well, but those two particularly so. For Q, and again, I have to give credit to Carla Goldman, my beloved colleague.
I love Carla.
Lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Right. No, Rabbi, you know her, right? Of course, from HEC, right? So Carla is the one who gave me the answer. Q, she reminded me that in Israel Zangwill's novel, The Melting Pot, there is a Sephardic Jewish family at the center of attention named Quixano, the Quixano family. So I'm using the Quixano family for Q, which hits a couple of notes. It's fictional figures, Sephardic, right, and so forth. So it was a great get for that reason. And then for X, again, Carla came up with the solution. She said, why not use X as signifying all of those immigrants who were illiterate, who couldn't spell their name and just would like make a mark like an X. So X is for the illiterate immigrants as a group. So again, I thought very clever and it works. And I'm more than happy to, if you want to hear more about that list, I'm more than happy to share. I could go on for a long time on that.
So no one's put their hand up, but I have a question. And that is, are there patterns in defining the Jewishness of celebrity other than being born Jewish or converting to Judaism? Are there celebrities that have practice? Are there celebrities that are just cultural? Like, what are the, how do you define Jewishness as you're looking at celebrity?
Right. Well, yeah. So that's an important distinction. I probably should have done it myself. Who is a Jew? What constitutes being Jewish? As a historian, as a Jewish historian, I may noted this the other day. My subject is the Jewish people. Right. So it doesn't matter what they do or say or how they behave. A Jew is a Jew by virtue of being descended from Jewish parents, and therefore having the potential to lead a Jewish life. So Jewish identity, or the identification of someone as a Jew, can apply to someone who's a bad Jew, right? Who's a non-practicing Jew. One very good, nice example of that is Sandy Koufax, right? Sandy Koufax becomes this iconic figure because he respected Jewish tradition. Right. And so rabbis say to Sandy Koufax, "Oh, you're my rabbi. You're such a great role model for young Jews." The fact of the matter is that during that Yom Kippur, Sandy Koufax sat alone in his hotel room, out of sight, out of mind. This was in Milwaukee. And to this day, apparently, there are synagogues in Milwaukee where you can go and some older person will say, "Yes, Sandy Koufax was in shul that day. He sat right over there." He was nowhere to be found. He was not a practicing Jew. He was not a Jewish Jew in that regard. And yet he comes to represent that for others. So at a certain level, it's less important what the reality is. More important is what we project onto them. The act of, or the process of Jewing is an act of projection. It's us projecting our Jewish identity and our Jewish identity dilemmas and challenges onto this simulacrum, right? So, Rabbi, did I answer the question, or?
Yeah, you did. So what popped into my mind is, and these articles come up from time to time about Elvis's mother really being Jewish, right?
Right.
And, so the projection of Jewishness upon Elvis, and indeed, if you go to Graceland, he was very, very benevolent to the Jewish community. He gave a lot of money.
Right.
So, the fact is that Jewish celebrity, is that not Jewish celebrity? And how does one define it if it's just projection? And you have all these articles about it, what are the lines?
So quite right. Once you have a lot of those articles, that association is made repeatedly, then he's in the category. Then you can talk about the Jewishness, or the virtual Jewishness of someone like, we mentioned Charlie Chaplin before. Chaplin is not Jewish, but he's been identified as a Jew so many times that he becomes a virtual Jew. That's not my phrase. That's the phrase. It's an article about some certain people that have had Jewishness projected onto them. I would put Elvis in that category, even though he may have some Jewish background, several generations before. The fact that he is that we hook him, we pull him into that discourse. It puts him in the category of a virtual Jew. Another example is, you may recall the TV show Rhoda. Rhoda was a character on the Mary Tyler Moore show. She was the Jewish friend of Mary Tyler Moore. It spins off as its own show. Valerie Harper is the name of the actress. Valerie Harper did a great job of playing a Jewish girl, but she herself is not Jewish, right? So that's also a good example of someone who is oftentimes linked to being Jewish, but despite the fact that she's not, she still fits the category of a virtual Jew, someone that we may choose to see as Jewish from time to time. I think Elvis is, probably there.
I just want to check in with Jim. He put a thumbs up, and I don't know if he meant to raise his hand. Jim, did you have a question, Jim Strauss? You can shake your head no or yes.
I was wondering whether you have any fear of anti-Semitism and choosing these Jews to publicize. And your book on New York Jews, do you think, given the increase in anti-Semitism, you think that's a problem?
There's a lot of ways I can answer that. I've been teaching and writing quite a bit about contemporary anti-Semitism, so it's very much on my mind, and so there's a lot I could say. But in terms of the connection between this kind of work and that, I'll say two things. One is that another part of the Jew-hooing impulse is a kind of response to anti-Semitism, right? The anti-Semitites say the Jews are bad. We'll show them, look what Jews have done. Look what Jews have accomplished. Look at all the good Jews. And so it is, in a very real sense, it is itself a rejoinder to anti-Semitism. There's a wonderful singer-songwriter named Dan Byrne, B-E-R-N. I invite you to look him up. He's a great musician. He has a song, what's the name of the song? Forgetting the title of it, but it's his song of Holocaust memory. And in the song, he basically says, take that, Hitler. Look at, there's Al Jolson and Danny Kaye and Lauren Bacall and Sandy Koufax and Barbara Streisand. Like, he'll list all of these famous Jews. And the song is him dancing on Hitler's grave. Right? In other words, you tried to destroy us. You anti-Semites are against us. But look who we are. Look what we've accomplished. So I do think that there is a link. There is a relationship between anti-Semitism and this practice of Jew-hooing. That's to say, one of the reasons we do it is to counter the anti-Semitic accusation. The other thing I would say to you is, in the last few years, there's been discussion about what to do with our own Jewish identity and public Jewish identification in the wake or in the face of rising anti-Semitism. And some people have said, well, I'm gonna go the other direction. I'm gonna wear males oftentimes are going to say, I'm now going to wear my kippah wherever I go, and as a sign of Jewish pride, to thumb my nose at the anti-Semites. Again, as with everything, it's possible to go a little too far with something like that. But I just think that's the better, personally speaking, I think that's the better direction. If we have a choice of hiding our Jewishness versus trumpeting our Jewishness in response to anti-Semitism, I think it's a kind of capitulation to the anti-Semites, right? It's almost like a terrorist wants to terrorize you. And one response to terrorism is not to be terrorized. So I'm on that side of the fence. I don't think you're by asserting your Jewish identity, I don't think you're adding to or exacerbating the anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism is going to be there anyway. So that's my personal response or thought to that is, I don't like giving in to the anti-Semites of the world. I think we're bigger and better than that.
So I hope you're okay with one more question because we started a little late.
I've got all day.
Oh, good. I'm sure my folks have lots of questions.
I'm your scholar in residence. I'm in residence.
So Bob asks, does Leonard Cohen belong somewhere?
Oh, well, Leonard Cohen is so wonderful. Those of you, my mom is 87 years old, and a couple of years back, I turned her on to Leonard Cohen, and she's now a big Leonard Cohen fan. I want to suggest to you that Cohen is also the right time. He becomes famous right around this period as well. He is a very interesting figure Jewishly in that he's both very, very Jewish over the course of his life, and he's a Buddhist monk as well. He's not only Buddhist, he's a Buddhist monk, right? He takes Buddhism very seriously. So he's a really interesting figure in terms of his own personal religious practice and identity. I think because he's Canadian, maybe that's one reason he doesn't rise to the same level for me as these figures in terms of would I have chosen him for this book. I'm certainly a big fan. I think he's an extraordinary artist and cultural figure. If you've never had the chance, there was a traveling museum exhibition that was really one of the best I've ever experienced, in that didn't just tell the story of his life, but it really created all kinds of immersive experiences to get you into his music and to get you to appreciate his art. And more recently, I did see, again, I want to recommend it. There is a documentary film not just on Leonard Cohen, but on one specific song of Leonard Cohen's, obviously Hallelujah. If you get a chance to see the film treatment of Hallelujah, I want to highly recommend it. It's really quite extraordinary an experience and a film. And yeah, I can't say enough about Leonard Cohen. I love Leonard Cohen. But again, you know, the level of fame, what Bob Dylan called famiosity, the degree of celebrity was part of my underlying assumption here is that the greater the fame, the greater their impact on us. And ultimately, that's what I was going for. So as much as I love Leonard Cohen, I'm not sure his impact on us and on the culture is at the same level as Dylan is.
Darla, you have another question.
I just have a very quick comment, and it goes along so closely, in my opinion, to what the conversation has been today and even yesterday. And it's a Netflix movie that is playing now called The Champion, and it's based on a true story of a Jewish boxer who is captured and brought to Auschwitz, and how he becomes a total hero during the war. I think a lot of people don't know the story, but it's a great little film on
Darla,
Netflix.
are you sure about the title? It's called The Champion?
It's called The Champion.
Okay.
I never knew anything about him, but it's just really a terrific movie.
Yeah. There was a film of that with Willem Dafoe. It's not that, it's another film.
No. This is a recent,
Yeah, okay.
really
I'll take a look.
recent.
Thank
It
you.
might be dubbed parts of it,
Yeah.
but it just shows the camp and the life in the camp and the influence he has. And because he actually becomes a hero to the Germans. He's from the Netherlands, but just a great story. And if anybody's looking for something that I think is a really positive little movie, that's it. And it is on Netflix.
Thank you.
Anybody else with questions? Well, since I see
Great
no
job, Bob.
Thank you so much. I know
My great pleasure.
I see a statement. This has been wonderful. As someone who grew up in New York as a hardcore Brooklyn Dodgers fan, I remember the Koufax stories as if they occurred yesterday. I want to thank you so much for being our scholar in residence this weekend, for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your research with us. It has been truly a pleasure to listen to you. I know that everybody is so appreciative and we have learned so much. So thank you. And I hope that your finger gets better. And the dog is okay?
It is broken, by the way. So yeah, thank you.
No. Oh no. And you taught yesterday through a broken finger. So wow. You know, we offer you a Misha Berach. We will keep you in our prayers. Let us know how it heals.
I appreciate that.
And my friends, thank you so much for coming today. I wish you all a fantastic Sunday. And just a reminder, Lunch and Learn on Thursday. We are doing the podcast Women Rabbis Talk. And I will see you at services on Friday night as well.
And can I just say Lunch and Learn is including pizza this time?
It is going to include
You need
pizza.
to come and eat the pizza.
Thanks all. It was
Thank
lovely
you
meeting
very
all of you. I hope we do it again sometime.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shalom, shalom.